what are we going to talk about here? Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about why we're talking about productivity, why it's important as an F1, what happens if you're not productive, if you're just like the biggest brain who got distinction in finals and you go in and you try to change everyone's management plan and stuff like that, and what your role really is as an F1. We're going to talk about the importance of having trusted systems in your day-to-day working and how that can really help you. We're going to talk about a corny American productivity system called Getting Things Done, which some of you may have heard of, and how that can be relevant to junior doctors. We're going to talk about a little bit about teamwork, and this isn't going to be some crappy communication skills stuff. We're going to actually talk about how to actually work with other F1s, how to deal with F2s like Rob, who are going to start bossing you around. And then finally, we're going to talk about bleeps and how to handle bleeps effectively. Okay, so the first thing to say is that as an F1, chaos is 100% your enemy. And you may not be aware of this sort of cognitive state at the moment, but there comes a time, and it will happen to you probably in your first week or two, where you've got a list as long as your arm of things to do, but your bleep just keeps going off and you can't get anything done, and you suddenly just get this, what I call it, cognitive tinnitus. So like you a complete standstill. You've got so many things going on in your mind, you just can't go forward with anything. So part of this talk is to try and help you avoid being in this situation of chaos. Unfortunately, a lot of your bosses regard you rather like a trained monkey stroke PA who basically knows enough about medicine to be able to understand what they're talking about. But basically your job is to go around and do the stuff that other doctors don't want to do. You know, stuff like organizing a list, booking patients in the theatre, going and taking bloods and serial ABGs and stuff like that. So it's important when you're going into your F1 to have a little bit of humility. Now, you guys I'm not saying that you guys are arrogant, but you've worked incredibly hard to get where you are right now, to have qualified as a doctor, and you should be congratulated upon that. But as in so many so many areas of life, and you would have experienced this already, you've just gone from the top of one system and you're now going to the bottom of another system. So when you arrive, at the very beginning on day one, just bear in mind that as doctors go, unfortunately, you're down at the bottom again. But don't worry, it doesn't last long. You'll find your feet. And I love the way that there are sirens going on in the background. That kind of makes it sound as if we're doing this at the hospital. Actually, where we're doing it is right by a main road, which is probably why. But it does make it a little bit more authentic and hopefully get you in the mood. Okay, so I'm going to share now a few of the things that Rob and I have learned along the way about productivity and how to be a really, really awesome and organized F1 doctor. Okay, so the first thing is you need trusted systems. You need a way that you're comfortable with of working on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so why is this important? Okay, so let's have a look at this slide. This is animated. I'm not sure how well this is going to transmit, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. So at the top here, we've got a whole load of things that you're going to be asked to do. Okay, you might be asked to take blood. You might be asked to go and review a patient, to get a CT, sort out an outpatient appointment, speak to relatives. And all of these things are going to be coming at you from various sources over the bleep. Perhaps you've been told by your SHO, perhaps you've had a call from your registrar on your mobile or your consultant or something like that. And of course, you've got various places to write this stuff down. So I'm sure many of you, particularly the girls, would have been out to Ryman's on a special trip, maybe with your parents, and you would have bought a lovely new leather folder or clipboard, and you're organizing it and you're planning. You're going to have all your forms in there and everything like that, ready to go for when you start work as an F1. And that's fantastic. So you got your folder. You might also have a ward list. The ward list is going to be your best friend. We're going to talk about ward lists in a moment and why they're really important, but that's another thing that you're going to have in your folder. You also got a smartphone, hopefully an Apple smartphone. Sorry, I'm biased. But you're going to have a smartphone, and you might be keeping some information in there as well. And you might have other bits of paper. I've known junior doctors to be writing things on their arms, to be writing things on their hands, and all sorts of places. as they come in. Okay, so all of these things are flying in. Okay, all these things you've got to do. And as they're coming in, you're putting them in different places. You're putting the taking blood in your folder. You're putting the speaking to relatives on your ward list, the outpatient appointment onto your smartphone, the CT you've just written on your hand because you were told very quickly and you didn't have time to open up your folder and find the right place. So all these things are coming in through different places. Okay, this is a very poor system. And this is one of the things that will create that situation where you feel completely overwhelmed because you don't really know where anything precisely is. Okay, so having a system of dealing with stuff that's coming at you and the way in which you go about doing things is really important. But it's a system that you must use again and again. It's like a set of rules. It's like an algorithm that you have that you always use. It helps you feel in control. It helps you prioritize what you need to do. It keeps you confident. Now, that's really important as a junior doctor. You need to feel confident that you're on top of the things that you need to do. It keeps you agile. And what does agile mean? It doesn't mean, I don't mean, fit in terms of, you can do the splits or whatever, like anything like that. What I mean by agile is the ability to respond to change. Okay, so suddenly, if an emergency comes in and you've got a long list of things to do, you feel confident stepping away from that long list of things to do, coping with that emergency, but at the end of it, being able to come back and resume what you were doing and get things done effectively. It reduces this state of cognitive tinnitus, with which you will be very familiar in the next couple of weeks, and therefore prevents what I was talking about at the beginning, which is chaos. Okay, now this guy is very, very corny. He's called David Allen. He wrote a book called Getting Things Done, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity. I don't know whether any of you guys have read it. Please don't go away and read it. You should be enjoying your lives between now and when you start doing F1. But he does have some very, very sound principles in here, which I want to explain because they're really, really relevant actually to functioning as a junior doctor in the hospital. Okay, so this is what Getting Things Done is all about. Okay, I'm not going to go through this. If you want to have a look at it, it's in the pack of slides that we sent you. The essence of it is that you can divide up your tasks and your patients into various specific entities. Okay, so there's this nomenclature of things being action, project, or context. Okay, now just bear with me here. This may seem a little simplistic, but it will all come together in a minute. So what is an action? Okay, an action is a single job or task. It's a single thing. Okay, so it might be reviewing a patient. It might be going and taking bloods from a patient. It might be organizing a CT scan. It's a single thing that you can concentrate on at any one moment and go and do. Okay, a project in GTD, David Allen's terms, is a grouping of related actions. Okay, now in the case of medicine, this is going to be the patient. Okay, so an individual patient could be regarded as a project in GTD terms, and an individual patient may have tasks like take bloods, go and review them, organize a CT. Okay, and often this is how your ward list will be organized. You'll have a table which will have each of your patients, and then you'll have a series of tasks with checkboxes, nice checkboxes there, and you go and do them. However, when this becomes really powerful is when we think about context. Okay, now context is the thing or the location which you need to be in to complete a specific action. Okay, so for example, to take bloods, you might need to be on a specific ward, like Juniper ward that we've mentioned here. In order to go and speak to someone, the pathologist, about some histology, you might need to go down to the lab. Okay, but you can imagine that if you have a patient with lots of different single actions, each of which has a different context, okay, then what's going to happen is if you just focus on the patient and all of their individual actions, you're going to be running around like a headless chicken, going from the ward down to the lab, to back to the CT department, the radiology department, and that kind of thing. So actually, as a junior doctor, you need to organize yourself not according to the patient. Okay, when you start your day, you don't look at your ward list and go, right, I'm going to go and do everything for Mr. Smith. I'm going to go and do everything for Mrs. whoever. Okay, what you need to do is you need to look at your list and say, right, what are all the individual actions for all my different patients that I can get done in radiology? And then you go down to radiology and you get all of those things sorted. What are all of the individual actions for all of my patients that I can get sorted out on the ward? And you go to the ward and you sort those things out. This may seem like common sense to a lot of you, and I'm sorry if that is the case. This is something actually that most doctors come to fairly naturally, and if you're an experienced medical student, you will have already realized this. But it's really important that you organize what you're doing according to context, the thing or location for where you need to be. Okay? So, when you're thinking about any specific job, take bloods, organize CT scan, do X, Y, and Z, you need to think about it both in terms of the patient, okay, obviously it belongs to a patient, but also the context, where you need to be, what you need to have available to actually get that specific thing done, okay? So, you've seen this slide before. This is our basic chaotic system where we've got the bleep and people talking at us and the phone and all these different tasks coming in. Okay. This is the next principle, which follows on from what David Allen says in his book. Okay. You need to have a single trusted place to place these individual actions as they come at you from the various sources. Okay. So they're all coming in here, take blood, review the patient, get the CT scan, sort out the outpatient appointment, speak to the relatives. Okay, they're all going into what you would call the inbox. Okay, so what is an inbox? Okay, the best inbox of all is a blank sheet of paper. Okay, which what you do is you put it on the front of your nice folder, or at the very, just if you open the folder on the very inside of it, and as things come at you, you just scribble them down right there. But that is the only place that you put them, okay? Other options are, traditionally in the GTD system, people have described using flashcards. I've known people to implement this very effectively using just the dedicated notes app on their phone. Of course, make sure that your phone is passcode protected and stuff like that, because there are patient confidentiality issues and stuff going on there. And some people even use dedicated task management apps, things like OmniFocus or Things, and there's about 400 million of them in the various different app stores for Android and Apple. In my opinion, the best thing is a single sheet of paper, which gets replaced at the start of every day, and that becomes your scratch pad, your inbox, where you deal with everything that comes at you. Okay, so stuff's in your inbox, okay? You've got all of these things that are coming in. A couple of times a day, you need to actually process this inbox and decide what you're going to do with each item and how you're going to prioritize. And you've got 3 options for each of those things that are sitting in that inbox. You can either do them, okay? Now, I highly recommend this. If something comes in, say, prescribe, you're on nights and the nurse calls and said, can you prescribe some Zopiclone for a patient? We'll talk about Zopiclone later, but can you prescribe some Zopiclone for a patient? And perhaps you're lucky enough in your hospital to have e-prescribing, and it's going to take you just a couple of minutes to get it done, and you're in the right location to do it. Just get on and do it. Okay, so if you can be done quickly, if you're in the right place, just do it. Okay, you can defer it. Now, this is what's going to happen most of the time. You're not going to be in a position to deal with it. Obviously, if something comes into your inbox and it's emergency, you know, the patient is crashing or whatever, and we need you as an emergency, then, you know, you obviously need to go and deal with that. But most things you're going to have to defer, okay? And when you defer anything, it gets crossed off your inbox and it gets moved onto your patient list, okay? That's the rule. And the other thing is delegation. Okay, now this is the bit that you guys are going to really, really struggle with, and it goes back to the fact that you're kind of at the bottom of the food chain. But saying that, you're going to be working in teams often where there are other F1s as well who you can delegate things to, okay? And from the very beginning, you need to develop a relationship with your colleagues where you're not the one who's just doing everything. And you often see this in teams of F1s. There are like the lazy ones who just manage to do nothing and sit in the mess, and the very conscientious ones who just run around doing all the work. Okay? Don't suffer being the conscientious one running around doing all the work if you can avoid it. You need to establish yourself in that team and sit down at the beginning, middle, and end of the day and say, look, these are the things we need to do today. You go and do that. Or who would, the better way to say it would be, who'd like to manage these things, who'd like to manage those things. And that's a really important thing to do. If you're in a team of people, don't be the only one doing stuff. And also, even though it's difficult, don't put up with F2s who think that suddenly, because they're no longer F1s, they don't have to do any work. Okay, because they want to be surgeons or whatever, they can spend the entire day in theatre, getting experience and that kind of stuff. That's absolutely wrong. Okay, no, F2s should be helping with the F1's work. Yes, they are more senior, they are more experienced, but they should be helping you to actually do your job more effectively. They are part of that, most junior level within the hospital. Okay, now obviously it's more difficult to challenge them, but if you are coming across the problem whereby F2s aren't helping and you're overwhelmed, make sure that you first have a word with them, ask them for help. If they don't respond to that, then you might need to escalate it, speak to your registrar first, and then your consultant. So, you're working up the sort of, in military terms, the chain of command, so to speak. But I really want you guys to think about delegation and think of almost some sort of vocabulary you're going to use to try and ask people to help you. Okay, because you're not there alone. You're not by yourself. So you need to develop those communication skills to work with your colleagues effectively to get all the things done that you need to. Okay, so let's talk about now the pride and joy of any F1, which is the blessed ward list. Okay, now some hospitals, you might be lucky enough to work in a hospital where your ward list is generated automatically for you by some fancy electronic health record system, so you won't have to write it yourself. But most people are still going to be developing their own ward lists in an Excel or Word document. And you're going to have to take responsibility for that. Okay. Now, what you're going to find is when you first start, when you go on your couple of days of shadowing, if you're lucky enough to have that, the departing F1 is going to hand you their ward list. Okay. Now, don't feel that you have to continue using the ward list in the structure that other F1 who's departing has been using it. Okay. It's your list. Okay. You need to craft it in such a way that it's useful for you and it's also useful for your colleagues, because often, you're going to have the registrar and the consultant on the ward round, and they're going to ask you for a copy of the ward list at the start of the ward round so that they can follow what's going on. Okay, now I want to go through each particular column and point out some particular features on that. Okay, so the first is patient details. Okay, now this is really important. Okay, and a lot of ward lists don't have enough of the patient information, but you must have this, because if you don't have this, doing referrals, organising tests, looking up blood test results, telling your consultant where the patient is going to be a nightmare. Okay, so you need to write on the ward list, okay, obviously the name, try and get the full name, the date of birth, the patient identifier, and very, very importantly, the bed number. Okay, because nowadays when you walk onto a ward, in the old days when I was an F1, there would be a big whiteboard there with the patient's full name and all their information, so you could just walk onto the ward with your consultant and you'd be able to just find instantly the bed number. Nowadays, because of confidentiality issues, they tend to put very little information on that whiteboard, so it might be very difficult for you to figure out which. They might only put the initials, for example, and there might be tons of people with the initials JS on the ward, and you might not be able to figure out what bed number it is. So just make sure, this may sound simple, but it's going to be really important, that you get the bed number on your ward list for where the patient is. Okay, it's also so important when you're making a referral. If you're speaking to the cardiologist, you're a surgical F1, and your patient's gone into AF, and your colleagues have asked you to call the medical team. If you can tell the cardiology registrar that they are in that Ed Wallitt is in bed A2, then they're going to really love you for that, and they're going to be much more likely to go and see the patient because there's less friction. They know exactly where that patient. Okay, so that's the patient details. Let's move on to the problem list. Okay, now this is really, really important. We're going to be talking about problem lists a lot, both today and tomorrow. But for those who aren't familiar, a problem list is basically just a current snapshot of what's going on with that patient. And this is something you should be updating really every day, if not twice a day. Okay, so for example, for me here, who's the patient, I'm unlucky enough to have community-acquired pneumonia. I'm on antibiotics, and my other problem is end-stage renal failure, which is currently stable. Okay, so that's a nice quick snapshot of what's going on with that patient. And you should try and keep that up to date. I actually would probably want a little more information on that. I might have community-acquired pneumonia on augmentin, CRP, improving, or something like that. That would be a really useful snapshot. It's also great to have that because if you need to do a sudden referral or go and speak to a radiologist or something like that, then just before you walk in the door, you can just quickly memorize that problem list and you can sound really cool. Okay. So next is the jobs. Okay. Now, notice that there are two columns here. Okay. So there are outstanding jobs and new jobs. So outstanding jobs, obviously stuff that hasn't been done yet. It may have been left over from the day before. It didn't quite get done, or maybe something that perhaps you predicted at the end of the day yesterday when you were completing your list for the morning that you might need to do for that day. And notice with the jobs, okay, I've added the context. Remember we spoke about actions and context. I've added the context in brackets after the job. Okay, so that blood thing is going to need to be done on the ward. Okay, and that this will actually come to you naturally after a while, but you may want to develop your own sort of shorthand. You don't have to write ward. You could just, write just a W. For phone, you could just draw a little phone or something. But it will help you if you're scanning your list to figure out all the things that you need to do on the ward or all the things that you could do on the phone, etc., etc. And then notice we've got that final column there, new jobs. Now, if we go back a few slides, remember I spoke about how you've got your inbox, that stuff coming in. And then what you do is if you're going to defer something, you add it to your patient list. So that new jobs column is where all of that stuff that you're deferring actually goes. Okay, so in there, you're going to add the action, the context, and then you're going to add a nice checkbox, which we'll talk about more in a moment, which you're going to get great pleasure squiggling through once you've actually completed the job. Okay, a few more little tips. Okay, so we've already mentioned this. You need to have action and you need to have context. Some processes are not simply one stage. Okay, so if you imagine, and when you were a medical student, going and taking bloods was probably a one-stage process because the point was to take the bloods and practice the phlebotomy. But now you're a doctor, you actually need to make sure that you actually check those blood test results. So what you need to do is for some things, there are going to be multiple stages. So once you've taken the bloods, you wouldn't squiggle through or tick this box. What you'd actually do is once you've taken the bloods, you half fill it. Okay, and that is a mental written note so that when you can come back later, you can actually, when you've checked the results, you can then complete the box so that you know exactly that thing has been done. And this is not just for two-stage processes. If something is in 3 stages, you could divide the box up into 3, 4 stages, etc., etc. You can really develop your own systems around here to make you more productive. Okay. So are there any questions, Rob? Oh, they're all here. Okay. Okay, so someone's asked, does the list involve all the jobs needed to be done regardless of who is doing them? Okay. Now, that's a very good question. I would say probably yes. I would want to, if I wanted as a junior doctor to get a snapshot of what was going on in my team, then I would probably have all the jobs on there. But I wouldn't necessarily, I might sort of add the initials of the person who'd taken responsibility for that job maybe after it, just so I knew that that wasn't necessarily my responsibility. And the reason that's important is because you need to get a handle on everything that's going on. Let's say, for example, that the person who you delegated the job to, or who said was going to do it, something happened and they were called to an emergency or something like that. You need to be aware that that thing is still pending. Okay. Now, one of the problems with paper systems is they're not synchronized. Okay. So to actually find out whether that person's done the job, you're going to have to go and speak to them. Okay. But I would say yes, that you should be sitting down with your colleagues, beginning, middle, end of the day, and synchronizing your lists and putting all the jobs on there and the initials of the person. Okay, there was another question, Rob, I think. Yeah, so the list is really for everyone. Okay, so you're going to find that sometimes consultants couldn't care less about your list. Sometimes registrars couldn't care less about your list. Some consultants, though, are absolutely going to care and are going to want a copy of the list at the beginning of every single day, or maybe just a glance at it to know what patients they're looking after. Okay, and you'll find that people are very, very different on that. But it doesn't matter. You know, if you've done the patient list in the format that we've described, your consultant's going to be very, very happy with that because they can see all the pertinent information there, which isn't too verbose, but it's just right there for them to see. Okay, any other questions on the patient list before we move on? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. If any come up, then I'll try and answer them. Okay, so what about the patient list? Where is it going to live? So most of the time, it's going to live in a horrible folder on some shared drive on a ward computer, and you're going to have to dig through and find the right date and that kind of stuff. That's just an unfortunate consequence of the current state of IT in most hospitals. But if you are working as a sole F1, which if sometimes you will be if you're doing surgery, then there are a couple of other options that you can use. Some hospitals actually provide tablets and smartphones to that kind of thing. You could use a dedicated task management app for your list. I actually did this when I was an F2 at Chelsea Westminster in London doing orthopedics. I was a sole F1. I had a password protected task management app. And then what I would do is I would have my list on there and I could print it out. And I could also just hand the iPad to my consultant, who absolutely loved that at the start of each ward round. We've also developed at Podmedics an app called HouseOfficer, which is basically a productivity app. It hasn't been updated in a while. I know that a couple of people have been asking about that in the questions. We are working very hard to update it to a more modern look and to also add a few more features to make it compatible with iOS. Yes, you can get it on Android. If you search for HouseOfficer on the Play Store, you'll find that there is a version for Android there as well. We are working on new versions which are going to have lots of exciting new features which will allow more of this sort of context-driven way of working and things like that. We're also going to talk about another app in a bit called Induction, which is another tool for you guys for junior doctors. I should also say HouseOfficer app is free and always will be free. There's been, so someone's asking about data protection issues. Yes, absolutely, that is a concern. And everybody always asks this question, but at the end of the day, the first thing to note is that all the data in HouseOfficer app is encrypted to current NHS standards. It's got 256-bit AES encryption, which I know is gobbledygook to a lot of people, but basically means it's Department of Health compliant, and it has a passcode on it. And I'm sure your phones, if you're carrying them around in the hospital, they will also have a passcode on it. So therefore, I would ask you to consider what's more secure, a piece of paper in your pocket, which I have found copies of these on buses and all over the place in the mess, all that kind of stuff, or a password protected, encrypted app with the information. Okay, so you have to be logical about these things. If you're not sure, okay, then gather the evidence, take a look at the website, and ask someone in the IT department. But just beware, because often they will just say no to everything. And that's usually because they don't know the answer and it's just easier to say no. Sorry for my cynicism, but I did do it for 4 years. Okay, the next question, are phones allowed on the ward? Okay, so the answer to that question is generally yes. There are lots of things that we carry around all the time on the ward, whether that be our stethoscopes, whether that be your folder, all of these sorts of things. There have been studies done, because I know some people will be worried about phones and electrical equipment and interfering and stuff like that. There have been studies done which show that actually phones have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the electrical equipment and stuff like that. I mean, you can basically hold the phone right next to a ventilator and get someone to ring it, and there will be no voltage change in the ventilator whatsoever. Okay, so you can use your phone on the ward. Oh, okay, so I answered the wrong question. The question was using the phone on the ward, i.e. filling in the patient list. Yes, that's absolutely fine. Using a phone, using an iPad, it's going to take a bit of courage, if you're going to start doing something differently. But nowadays, certainly when I started doing it, people gave me funny looks. But nowadays, nowadays it's absolutely fine to use your phone on the ward and to use your iPad on the ward. And don't worry so much about people who go, oh, you're using your phone, you're probably playing Angry Birds or something like that. If anyone's really worried about that, then you can just explain what you're doing. It's not a huge issue. People will get used to it. To be honest, most people don't really care what you're doing as long as you're a good doctor. So the other question was, is the house officer app best for on-calls and nights? And actually the answer to that is yes. So it's particularly useful. If you don't want to just have your patient list on there, you might not be able to because you're working with other F1s and stuff like that. It's really good for nights. It's got this specific on-call mode, which you can basically use it as a kind of inbox, like I spoke about before. So you can have the phone in one hand and then the hospital phone in the other, taking the details and typing in. So as you can see here on the slide, we've got an example here, Pauline Spiker. We've got these various tasks that have come in. We've prioritized them, and you can just tick them off as you go. And if you click the little button here, it will give you the information about, further information about that specific item and stuff like that. So actually, if you can't use it as a patient list, it does work really well as a sort of on-call list to use at night. Can you sync it up amongst other F1s? That's the million-dollar question. The major issue with that at the moment is the security of synchronization. Okay, so making sure it's all very well having it encrypted and secure on your phone, but transmitting that data about patients over the airwaves to someone else's phone and syncing it is more questionable from an information governance point of view if it's not on a secure network. We are working really, really hard at Podmedics at the moment to try and figure out a way to do that is compliant with information governance by the Department of Health. And hopefully there'll be more on that soon. But the answer at the moment is no. But, do feel free, download the app. It's free. It's on Android, iPhone. Have a play. Okay, so that's enough about the app. We're going to move on now to talk a little bit about teamwork. Okay, so I think I've already said this already, but the most important thing with teamwork is all about delegation. Okay, you need to get comfortable with your communication with your colleagues and sort of saying, I'll go and do these 3 things. Can you go and do these 3 things? And organizing yourself that way. As I said, try and practice some phrases that you might use to try and get other people to try and help you out and do things. Another part of this working in a team is that you must try and meet with your junior colleagues who are working on the wards at least 3 times a day and establish that as an actual pattern that the team is accustomed to, so that you can synchronize your paper list, basically. So you can have a list, you can say, okay, I've done this. You can maybe transfer something. So say one F1 took the bloods, but has got to go and do something else in the afternoon. They might say to you, oh, can you take over responsibility for that and check it? Okay. So that's that. The other thing, which I didn't actually come to until fairly late in as an F1, is this idea of a second inbox. A second inbox, something that doesn't belong to you. Okay. Now, this really helps with the bleeps. Okay, people bleeping you constantly for small things. So what I recommend you do is you go out and you buy either a black and red or a calendar or something like that, and on the ward that you're working on, give it to the nurses, present it to them, put a little bow around it if you want, and say, look, at the start of every day, there's going to be a fresh sheet on here. If there's anything that's non-urgent, change this cannula, write up some fluids for overnight, this patient needs a non-urgent review or something, then please just write it in the inbox. Don't call me about it unless it's an emergency, okay? And if you do that, then you'll get bleeped a lot less often, and it will help with this cognitive tinnitus thing about really, really simple things, okay? Because you don't want to be bleeped constantly and interrupted about stuff which isn't urgent. But make a promise at the same time to the nurses on the ward that you will check that a couple of times a day, okay? You will go and you will look at it and you will transfer it to your patient list and you will get the tasks done. And that can really, really help to build trust between you and the nurses, and the nurses will love you for it. And believe me, if the nurses like you on the ward where you're working, your life will be a lot easier. Okay, let's talk about bleeps and hospital numbers and things like that. Quick question just coming about the notebook. Is it shared with other F1s or not? Absolutely. So if there are, it's for your team, but if there are other F1s and stuff in your team, then you should all share that same notebook. If there are lots of different teams working on the ward, then obviously you can't all use the same workbook. Otherwise, you're going to end up doing tasks for other people's patients and stuff like that. If you're working on multiple wards, then yes, there's no reason why you shouldn't get a small diary and give it to the nurses on, the various wards. Obviously, if you're working on 6 or 7 different wards, it's not going to be practical because you spend all your time running around checking the notebook. But most people are going to be on one ward, and that's particularly useful for that kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk briefly about bleeps and numbers. Okay, so first warning, beware the bleep. Okay, so when you start work, it's rather like becoming a police officer, and getting your gun. Once you start work as a doctor and you get your bleep, you suddenly think, yeah, I've made it. I've got this thing, people need me. I'm skilled, all this kind of stuff. But then as soon as you've been in work for about 24 hours, you realize that the bleep is the bane of your existence. And if you're unlucky enough, like I was, this is a picture of me carrying 3 of the blasted things, you'll get interrupted all the time, okay? But just remember something really important, okay? And it's to do with a concept called redundancy. And that is, you are not the only hospital in the doctor. Not the only doctor in the hospital, I should say. So basically, if you don't answer your bleep, okay, then if it's really urgent, they'll get someone else. If it's not so urgent, they'll bleep you back. Okay, so if you're seeing a patient, if you're in the middle of a procedure, okay, or anything like that, don't just walk away from your patient to go and answer your bleep. Okay, treat the bleep with a level of disregard almost. Yes, you are available, but your important things that you should be doing is actually looking after patients. Okay. And in fact, in some situations, and this is a point that Rob always says, but I've actually remembered to say it today, you should turn off the bleep or give it to somebody else. If you're going with your consultant to break bad news to a patient, that perhaps they've got a new diagnosis of cancer or something like that, then you give your bleep to someone else. There is nothing worse in the middle of that news than your bleep going off, and the patient feels awkward, you feel awkward, your consultant sort of looks at you with disdain. Okay, so don't be afraid to give your bleep to another F1 if you're going to do something like that. And then you can be like me and carry around 3 of them. Okay. So Rob is going to deal with handling on-call bleeps and what you do. But the essence is when someone bleeps you, you need to get to the question as quickly as possible, what do you want? Okay, because often And believe it or not, actually, nurses hate bleeping doctors. Okay, they're terrified, most of them. Okay, they'll start really nervously. They'll give you an entire history. They will have read through the entire notes, and they'll tell you all this information that you don't have time and you don't want to hear. Okay, you need to get as quickly as possible to the question. It may sound ruthless, but what do you actually want me to do? Okay, what is the problem? What's the essence of the problem? And often it's useful for you to lead the questioning after you got to that point. Okay, and then once you've received the bleep, you add it to your inbox. Okay. So when you start at your hospital, at the very start, in induction, and when you're doing your first bit of shadowing, one of the first things you need to find out is, how do I bleep? Okay, and memorize that as quickly as possible. Okay, you need to figure that out from day one. Now, the other thing which a lot of doctors don't know you can actually do is call extension numbers from your mobile, your personal mobile, okay, as if you were calling from outside the hospital. Okay, so try and figure out if there's a little prefix that you can add to the hospital extensions that allow you to call from your mobile. Now, this is really, really useful. Say you're in a big hospital with long corridors and you get bleeped and you just want to answer it while you're walking down to the mess to have your Cocoa Pops. If you know what that prefix is, you can just pull out your phone and just dial the number and just call it right away. Okay. The other thing that you should do, and a lot of ward lists actually, if you've noticed, have at the very top of them a little matrix of the most important numbers. Okay, but if yours doesn't have that, try and create it. Okay, what you do not want to be doing, okay, is spending your entire life clogging up switchboard, calling them, asking, oh, what's the cardiology SHO's bleep? What's the registrar's bleep? It's boring for you. Switchboard hate it. And also it clogs them up. So, other more important calls can't get through. Okay. Now that brings us very nicely onto another free app that Podmedics have created called Induction. Now, this is something we're actually probably more excited about than the House Officer app, because this is an app which basically gives you all of the extensions and bleeps for the hospital where you are working. Okay. But the exciting thing about this app is that even though it's got all the hospitals in it, all the numbers are crowdsourced. Okay, so you can actually enter a number in there, a ward number or an extension or something like that, and your colleagues then will all have access to that number in the same hospital. It's also really useful because if you know the prefix for the hospital, in a single click, you can just call that number straight from your mobile phone. Before you start in August, we're releasing a new update to the app, which is going to have a separate area where you can store personal codes, things like the blood gas machine, codes for doors and stuff. This stuff isn't crowdsourced, but fairly useful. We're also putting on something called FAQs, which is basically kind of little questions that might be there for, a question might be, how do I bleep? And then someone will answer it. Another question, who do I need to speak to get an echo? And then once again, this will be crowdsourced and you'll get it. The Android is currently in development, and we hope to have it available by the beginning of August if our developers will get their act together. Would you run up a good phone bill? Well, probably yes. You don't have to use it as a direct caller. You can actually use it just as a directory. It shows, actually, this screenshot isn't totally accurate. The current version, all these numbers here on the right actually show the number. So you could actually use this app sitting by a hospital phone and it would give you the extension or the bleep number. So the quick dial thing is there just as a sort of convenience, but you don't have to use it if you don't want to. If you log into your hospital and you select it and there aren't any numbers, you can add them yourself, or you can make us do the work for you. Send us a photograph of a few numbers and we'll add them for you, or just email us a list of numbers and we'll make sure that they get added for you as well. So it's really useful. There's been a question of what is crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing basically means that Dr. A enters a number for A&E X-ray, and when Dr. B goes to the app that didn't have that number there before, it's now there as well. Okay, so it means if one person adds it, then it's available for everyone. Okay, it's a really great way, just putting in a few numbers of supporting your colleagues and helping yourself in the long term as well. So if you want to take a look, there are the websites. There is a web version, actually, inductionviewer.com, which will allow you to get the same things. But do have a look at it, and we hope to have the Android version out very, very soon. Okay, so we're nearly at the break. In fact, we are at the break. Are there any other questions before we move on? Or not move on, before we relax and take a sip of our 7-Up?